Hey, what's up? This is Sifu Kuttel, and in this video, I want to take a closer look at Dian Wei, the Han Dynasty warrior, Cao Cao's personal bodyguard, and the weapon that he was using when he wasn't swinging other enemies around as weapons. All in today's episode of Dynasty Weapons. This is a ji. Now, you may recognize this from a previous video I made about Liu Bu and the long pole ji, and although the blade is the same, you really can't call this the exact same weapon. You see, the ji is a really versatile weapon, and it can be mounted on different lengths of poles and even used as just a single hand blade. And today we're going to look at it as the short pole version, and a really unique weapon from the Han Dynasty. Originally, the ji was mounted on an extremely long pole and used in chariot warfare. So a person in one chariot could reach all the way over to the enemy chariot and peck or poke the charioteer or hook and pull at the archer that was sitting in the chariot. It was also carried on a long pole, which was either used by the cavalry on horseback or on foot by the infantry, and it was probably the most popular way of mounting the blade on the weapon as the long pole halberd. Another mounting version, and the one that I want to talk to you mostly about in this video, is this one here, the short pole ji. Now, we do know that the short pole ji existed. We've seen this on tomb engravings and in battle records, but we don't know exactly how long the pole was. This is because, unfortunately, there were no standard military measurements or anything like that recorded, and unfortunately, the pole of the ji is made out of wood, so over time it decomposes, leaving only the blade and the metal fittings to exist. So we can only really guess the length of the short pole ji. This is also where I need to make my disclaimer and explain how I got the measurements for mine. So first off, I'm no historian. I'm not an archaeologist or an expert in ancient Chinese weaponry. My contribution to this is from my 20 years of traditional Chinese martial arts training, which has given me the experience of over 30 different traditional weapons. And through training, drills, forms, and sparring, I have an idea of how these can be used. So here's the short pole ji mounting that I came up with. Now, I did try a couple of different lengths, and I settled on this one based on 3 specific factors. One, it had to be about the same length as different weapons that were being used as well on the battlefield. So looking at like Han Jian, the short dao, or the long dao that you may encounter on the battlefield. 2, it had to be able to be used as a two-handed weapon, because with a short pole, you do still have an ability to gain some more leverage. So there should be enough spacing for 2 hands to hold this. And 3, it had to be used in a single hand. We'll talk about this more later, but commonly the ji was used either with a shield in the other hand, a different weapon, or in pairs. So it was mostly used as a single-handed weapon, and it cannot be too long, which would make it too awkward and too slow and create too many vulnerabilities in combat. The length of the pole is 77 centimeters, and with the blade mounted, it totals out at 102 centimeters, which is just shorter than the Flying Phoenix Han Jian. That's a total length of 106 centimeters. However, grip position has everything to do with the combat length of the weapon. So since I'm not grabbing down at the bottom, the best hand position for the moving weight and balance for this puts its attack or combat length at about 70 centimeters, which is about 15 centimeters shorter than the Flying Phoenix Han Jian. So in direct comparison, fighting against a Han Jian would put this at a disadvantage for thrusting reach. However, this side blade adds so much value to the weapon, not only in the attacking with hooking or pecking techniques, but also in the defensive of catching. So using this area to stifle the other person's weapon to catch and to block becomes really, really important in how this ji was used. Now, as for the weight, the Flying Phoenix weighs about 1 pound 12 ounces, and the ji is 2.5 pounds. So any longer, this would be very, very slow and cumbersome to swing around, and you'd fatigue very quickly in combat. As for the two-handed weapon, on the other hand, it suffices. Now, I actually would want a little more length to this, but honestly, if you're going to start adding more length to the pole, you may as well just jump up to the long pole G, like the halberd length that we saw in the previous video, because that's going to have your best reach and weight and leverage ratio. The pole itself is quite interesting because it has 5 sides. It has a pentagonal cross section similar to a banana. Now we know that ancient Ji had this at least in their fittings, which makes perfect sense because you can tell exactly where the back of the mount would be and where the blade should point. But what makes it quite interesting is on the bottom fitting for the pole is a 5-sided shape as well. So this leads us to speculate that the entire span of the pole could be 5-sided. Now this is a lot more important than I had originally realized. You see, when I analyze how these weapons could be used, one of the things that I do is I try to make a reverse perspective to see what would I do if I was facing somebody who was handling a Ji. And one of the first things that came to my mind is that I would actually try to strike this protruding blade, because there's a lot of leverage here that works against the wrist, and hopefully I could twist their wrist or even knock it out of my opponent's hand. Then I remembered the 5-sided grip, and I went and I tested out by striking this side blade against my striking dummy. And of course, it's no full power hit from another weapon, and I'm totally prepared for the moment, but I wanted to feel if it would compromise my grip in the slightest. And you know what? It actually further cinched into my grip, similar to like how a wrench cinches up on a bolt. So I do feel that this is indeed a very important aspect of the Ji construction, and most likely was a standard method of constructing the Ji pole. I shaped these 2 poles by hand with a block planer, and it took me just over an hour. So it is definitely realistic that this could have been done as part of standard Ji construction, especially when you compare it to the amount of time that is spent on just forging and sharpening and tempering the blade, as well as casting the metal fittings. So it could definitely be a part of the construction and not at an expense of extra time. The decorative pattern that is painted onto the Ji is actually based off of some designs that the LK Chen team had sent over to me. They were some designs that were used on some of the spears and other pole arms of the time that were painted in lacquer. Now the reason that we know that those existed is because although the wood decomposes over time, lacquer will last for millennia, as we see now. And although I picked the simplest pattern, this still took a few hours to paint because of painting the vermilion over the black just took multiple coats. And it's actually a little more complicated than you would expect. But I have to say, not too bad, you know. I did a pretty good job, if I say so myself. Also, LK Chen did include some leather straps to bind the blade to the pole, but I ended up using white paracord. This is based on a couple of things. One, as you saw in my previous video, I had it mounted on a long pole. Now I have it mounted on short pole, and I've been testing out different ways of mounting it. So I didn't want to dirty up or ruin the leather cord. And then also I really liked the contrast of this white cord over the black and the red. So I thought it looks pretty nice, but typically it does come with a leather cord, and you can learn how to tie that by checking out this video right here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways of carrying a Ji was actually in a pair of double Ji. Now, one of the most famous Han Dynasty warriors of the time to use a pair of double Ji was none other than a man named Dian Wei. This guy was described as a towering warrior with an incredible amount of strength and an imposing presence. His first claim to fame was when he assassinated a county chief by disguising himself as a marquis, walking straight into the chief's manor, killing him and his wife. And then as the guards rushed in and followed him, he looked so imposing and menacing that he just simply walked out. He grabbed his ji, he grabbed a sword, and he continued to walk. Everyone there, over 100 men, followed him as he walked himself out of town, and no one dared to attack him because they were just too scared of him. He simply walked over to his horse and his men about a mile out of town, hopped on, and rode away. This actually gained him praise as a hero because he avoided unnecessary bloodshed. There was another account of him showing his strength when there was a terrible wind blowing at one of the war camps that he was at, and even over a dozen men couldn't steady a single banner. Dian Wei walked over, picked up the banner, and steadied it with just one hand. Dian Wei's fame grew to the point where just his presence made his allies empowered and his enemies cower. There was a saying among Cao Cao's army that was painted on banners. "In our camp resides the warrior Dian Wei, who wields a pair of ji weighing 80 jin in total," which is like 52 pounds each. That's insane. These are 2.5 pounds each, and my arms start to fatigue and get tired after like 20 minutes of swinging these things around. And I'm just swinging in the air. I'm not even in battle and fighting anybody or hitting anything. Dian Wei was eventually promoted to colonel and served as Cao Cao's personal bodyguard. He died protecting Cao Cao, making a last stand with about a dozen of his own men, heavily outnumbered, blocking the gate to allow Cao Cao to escape while fighting off enemies with a long pole ji and eventually his double ji when the enemies moved in close enough. As the battle went on, Dian Wei's men were eventually all killed, and Dian Wei himself had sustained several wounds all over his body. But he continued fighting, and at one point he grabbed 2 enemies and he killed them with his bare hands. He then rushed forward and slew several more enemies before finally succumbing to his wounds. Just before his death, he was still glaring and swearing at the enemy. It was only after confirming that he was actually dead did anybody dare to approach him and decapitate him. This actually comes from the records of the 3 Kingdoms. This is before it got spiced up even more for the novel, The Romance of the 3 Kingdoms, where he actually grabbed the 2 enemies that he killed and started swinging them around as weapons. Now, if you're wondering why you've never seen ji like this, especially in depictions of Dian Wei, it's because a lot of the media, a lot of the pictures, a lot of the Chinese opera depictions of him, and even later on in the video games and movies that we see of him, they're all based on the Romance of the 3 Kingdoms depiction of him, and during that time it was the Song Dynasty, so they based it off of the design of the Song Dynasty blade, not the real Han Dynasty blade. Now let's look at the different ways that the short pole ji would have been used. Probably one of the most common ways that the short pole ji was paired would be with a shield. Now, this is not a Han Dynasty shield, this is a Qing Dynasty shield, so it is going to be a little historically inaccurate here. The Han Dynasty shield it covered a little bit more, it had a forward angle, and it was almost rectangular in shape. So you'll have to bear with me on that one. But the idea is more or less the same thing when we have a shield in our hand. We're looking at that protection. Now, if I'm in a line on the battlefield, I don't really have a lot of room to swing this back and forth. If I have people on either side on my team, I don't want to accidentally hit this guy or get in his way while he's fighting. So it limits me to a lot of just forward thrusting techniques and occasionally pecking techniques using that front or the forward blade. The thing about using this blade is it takes a little bit longer and it takes me away from my extra coverage. Where I can throw several forward thrusts this way and thrust at very different targets very quickly. This I need to retract, set up, and attack. So I have to be very selective for when I use it. Also, in the case that it actually sinks in, it's going to take me some time to get it back out. Now the nice thing about pairing this with the shield is, in case it does sink in, I have protection while I'm trying to pry this out, even to the point where I can push with my shield to withdraw this. Now on attack and defense, if you're not going to thrust, you have a couple of options just by simply turning this blade a little bit so we have it at an angle. We can use this to catch the blade. So if I'm working on a line with a team here, I can stifle my opponent's attack. I can hinder their movement forward, catch their blade, and then now the guy next to me can stab him with the spear, or the person next to me can chop him with the sword. So I do have some options available there. And then of course we have that extra coverage with the shield. I wouldn't consider too much hooking or pulling just because of the direction that you would have to swing inward for that. So any kind of pulling motion would be moving back this way in case you get over their blade and you can try to scrape at the fingers or the hand. But really at that point, you may as well just be poking forward. Another pairing that you might find is that the lead hand or the shield hand takes the ji for more of a defensive posture, and then the other hand uses a sword for chopping and hacking. So now I can keep this ji forward and in the way of my opponent and make it kind of a difficult area to move, and I can catch and try to manipulate their weapon, and then of course try to chop either by pressing upward, chopping underneath, or defending downward, chopping over the top, okay? So again, if I'm pressing upward here, I can stab or I can slice through, or if I end up catching their weapon and pushing it downward from here, I can stab over the top, chop over the top, or slice all the way through depending on the technique itself. But this could also be a way of using the short pull ji. Another such pairing would be to work with the jian. So again, I would have the ji as more of the defensive hand, keeping this one in the way forward as an obstacle for my opponent, and then I can use the jian for chopping, slicing, slashing, and thrusting. The nice thing is here, especially if we're looking at the Han jian, like the Flying Phoenix, as I mentioned earlier, with that extra range, now I can meet my opponent's weapon and easily meet them and pierce and stab through without having to be too close here. So again, this gives me even more of an advantage to chop and attack my opponent. I can open them up and then try to move in from there. And this definitely could give that extra range difference that you lose when you use the ji with a shield or the ji with a dao. Now the final configuration that we can look at is having the Dian Wei version, the double ji. Now I would still follow that same approach that we've been following since the beginning, where you have one main defensive, like the shield, or like when we paired the ji with the sword or the jian. You want to have one hand that's going to be controlling and defensive, while the other one can start being more on the attacking side. It doesn't mean it's always the case. You can definitely just go in thrusting and hacking and pecking, but ideally, if you're going to square off with somebody, I would say use one to control their blade. Catch and control the blade while you attack. Catch and control while you attack, or just move in and press towards the body. So as soon as I can clear past that blade, I can extend forward. Now I can start attacking the body and make it very difficult and overwhelm my opponent to the point where they don't really know how or where to counter. Okay, so again, I would rely mostly on this front one to stay in control here. You have lots of attacking options from there, and you can use this to overwhelm the opponent. Another configuration is to just use a single ji and hold it with two hands. Now, I don't think that this would be the most common way of using the ji, because when it comes to using the weapon with two hands, you're probably going to be better off with the long pole arm version, because two hands are going to be occupied by the same weapon, meaning that if you swing through and you miss, now you have nothing to protect you. And in the case of the long pole arm, you at least have distance to your advantage there. So here it has to be very selective of when you're going to try to commit and swing through. However, I would still say that this can be a very effective weapon when held like this, because we have a lot more speed and leverage with this weapon. So once you do commit, once you do move in, you have a lot of power. And I would still hold this in more of a defensive position to make sure that I can catch my opponent's weapon or hook at my opponent's weapon using this side blade. So again, I would use this more for thrusting until you have that moment of commitment where you can really try to peck in towards them, try to pierce in that way. You can go from the sides or even trying to hook and pull. And this is one thing where I would say it has a leverage advantage, even compared to the long pole halberd. When you're closer, you're going to have more control. So whether I try to pierce into my opponent or get behind them to use this as a hooking technique, I'm going to have a little bit more control this way. Again though, like I mentioned, you have two hands occupied. So this would probably be something where you wouldn't attack from the front to try to hook at the person. Rather, in the front, it would be thrusting, catching their weapon, or just trying to hack and peck like an axe. If you're trying to hook and pull at them, it would be when they're not looking at you, from behind or from the side, where you can hook at the leg and pull, or hook at the body and pull. Whether you want to pull somebody down from a horse, or you want to pull them back and expose them for your buddy to end up stabbing or chopping at them. But this is definitely another option if you needed it. So I can tell you the Ji is a fascinating weapon, and we're still not done with it yet. We have a couple more configurations that we'll look at for using the Ji blade, and if you want to know more information about this, go to LK Chen's website. I'll leave a link in the description down below, as well as right here, and you can pick one up for yourself. And I hope you guys are enjoying how these videos are going in the Han Dynasty Weapons series. I think it's a really fascinating time that we really haven't had a chance to look at until just recently. So if you have any other information that you want to add that you may think I have missed, or if you need to correct anything, because like I said, I'm not a historian. I'm just trying to give you guys the best information that I can, and sometimes I can be wrong. So if you have any corrections, leave those down below and I'll pin those as well. Hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next video.